Chapter 1, The Invitation. Lena had always prided herself on her practical mind, dismissing superstitions as mere stories meant to scare children. But that had all changed the day she received the invitation. It came on a chilly November morning. She was going through her usual mail when an envelope, plain and unmarked, caught her eye. No return address. The only thing written on the front was an elegant, looping handwriting that made her pause. "You are invited to the Hollow House. Arrive before midnight." No signature, no explanation. Just those words. She tossed the envelope aside at first, assuming it was a mistake or some poorly conceived prank. But the more she thought about it, the more intrigued she became. She had heard whispers about the Hollow House, the old mansion perched on the hill just outside town. A place people had long since stopped visiting. It was said to be cursed, a place where time and reality blurred, where strange occurrences were as common as the falling leaves. But Lena wasn't one to fall for ghost stories. Yet something tugged at her, a curiosity she couldn't shake. After much hesitation, she decided to go. After all, it would make for a good story. And if nothing else, it would help her prove to herself that there was nothing supernatural about it. Chapter 2, The Hollow House. The fog was dense as Lena drove up the winding, lonely road that led to the Hollow House. Her headlights barely cut through the mist as the trees on either side loomed like dark, skeletal figures. Her grip tightened on the steering wheel, though she didn't want to admit to herself that something about this place made her uneasy. The mansion stood before her like a dark monument. Tall and imposing, its once grand facade was now weathered and decayed. Ivy clung to the stone like a creeping disease. Broken windows stared out at her, reflecting only emptiness. The air was still and cold, as though the mansion was holding its breath. Lena parked her car, hesitated for only a moment, and stepped out into the night. The gravel beneath her boots crunched loudly, unnervingly so. The smell of mildew and decay was thick in the air, and the oppressive silence of the place made her skin crawl. There was no going back now. She moved forward toward the mansion's front door. It creaked open without her even touching it, as though expecting her arrival. The darkness inside was suffocating. Dust hung in the air, and every step she took seemed to echo in the stillness. Faded portraits lined the walls, their eyes cold and watchful, as though the faces in them were alive, their gaze following her as she passed. Her breath quickened. This was no ordinary house. There was something here, something that didn't want her here. At the end of the hallway was a room with a faint, eerie glow coming from under the door. Hesitant, but driven by an unshakable need to uncover the truth, Lena approached it. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a room bathed in dim light. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror, its surface fogged over, like it hadn't been touched in years. But when Lena looked into it, she saw something that made her stomach turn. Her reflection was wrong. Her own face stared back at her, but her eyes, they were empty. Hollow. She blinked, but the emptiness in her eyes remained. The rest of the room seemed to shift, the walls darkening, the shadows stretching and twisting as if alive. The eyes in the mirror. They weren't hers. They were watching her. Chapter 3, The Hollow Eyes. Lena stepped back, her heart pounding. The mirror flickered, the shadows in the room seeming to reach out toward her. The cold, clammy air tightened around her chest as the whispering began, soft, almost inaudible at first, then growing louder, like a chorus of voices calling from the very walls of the house. "You shouldn't have come," a voice whispered, its tone hollow and distant. Lena spun around, her pulse racing. The air grew thicker, and she could feel something brushing against her skin, like invisible hands, brushing past her, lingering for a moment too long. "We see you," another voice murmured, this one closer, colder. "Now you are ours." The wall seemed to close in on her. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut before she could reach it, trapping her in the room. The whispering intensified. She could hear the voices clearly now, each one pulling at her consciousness, each one vying for her attention, making it impossible to think clearly. And then, the mirror flickered again, and her reflection. It wasn't hers anymore. The eyes in the mirror, her eyes, were dark, empty voids. A void that seemed to stretch into infinity, an endless abyss staring back at her. Lena reached out, her hand trembling as it touched the surface of the mirror. It was cold, colder than anything she had ever felt. The reflection rippled, distorting her features, twisting them into something grotesque. The room around her seemed to blur, and she felt herself being pulled into the mirror, as if it were a door opening to another world. And then, everything went dark. Chapter 4, The Forgotten. Lena awoke with a jolt, gasping for air, her mind swirling with confusion. She was no longer in the mansion, but in a place that seemed just as strange. The world around her was distorted. The landscape was blurred, like an unfinished painting, the colors bleeding into one another. She stood on cracked stone streets, surrounded by crumbling buildings that towered like silent witnesses to an age long past. The air smelled of decay and something far worse, something foul and rotten. The people, or what had once been people, walked past her without noticing. Their eyes were empty, hollow like the ones she had seen in the mirror. They didn't move like ordinary people. Their movements were stiff, jerking, as if they were nothing more than puppets being pulled by invisible strings. Lena tried to speak, to scream, but no sound came out. Panic surged through her, but no one seemed to care. The silence was deafening. In the distance, she saw it. The mansion, the hollow house. It loomed in the distance, taller and darker than before, its doors wide open. As she stumbled toward it, a figure appeared before her, a woman, her face pale and drawn, her eyes hollow like the others. "You shouldn't have come," the woman whispered. "Once you enter, you can never leave. You've seen the hollow eyes. Now you belong to them." Lena opened her mouth to ask what she meant, but no words came out. The woman stepped aside, her eyes filled with a sorrow that chilled Lena to the bone. The doors to the mansion slammed shut behind her, and the world around her began to crumble. The hollow house had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many before. And now, she was one of them. Chapter 5, The Endless Cycle. Lena awoke again, though she wasn't sure if it was truly waking. She was back in the hollow house, standing before the same mirror. The same emptiness stared back at her, the same hollow eyes staring into her soul. But this time, she understood. She wasn't just a visitor. She was a part of it now. The house, the mirror, the eyes, they had all been waiting for her. The whispers began again, softer this time, like a lullaby sung by the shadows themselves. "Welcome home," they said, and Lena realized that she had become just another part of the house's endless, spiraling story. The invitation, the pull, it had all been leading here. And so, she stood before the mirror, trapped in an eternity of hollow eyes, unable to escape. Forever bound to the hollow house. No one who entered could ever leave. And neither would Lena.